The serial publication of James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man began nearly 6 months before the start of World War I, the conflict during which a young Dabrowski would be shocked by the sight of corpses on the battlefield. Dabrowski himself traced his realization that individuals operate on different levels initially to seeing different expressions on the faces of corpses and acts of heroism among atrocities in war. But the shocks of modernity to which both James Joyce and Dabrowski responded stretched beyond the horrors of war, accelerating social, technological, and intellectual change, uprooted former understandings in the early 20th century. A consideration of the intertextuality between A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Dabrowski's theories illuminates both the modernism of the latter and the development of Stephen Dedalus within Joyce's Künstlerroman, novel of artistic development. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is largely autobiographical, albeit not entirely. Joyce's own attitude toward the protagonist is still a matter for open debate, though certainly given that Joyce once remarked on the importance of the term young in the title, it would be a mistake to assume that Stephen's ideas are unproblematically those of the mature author. The language of the book itself parallels that ambiguity, as it is written primarily in free indirect discourse, which is to say third-person narrative that closely mimics the language of its characters. It is sometimes described as being halfway between quotation and paraphrase. In this way, we get close to the psyche of the developing Stephen without being restricted to what he can perceive. Across the 5 chapters following Stephen Dedalus from early childhood through the end of his university years, the 5 stages of development identified by Dabrowski in positive disintegration can be seen, albeit not always unambiguously. In the first chapter, the very young Dedalus exists mostly in a state of primary integration, though he shows clear signs of developmental potential. In the second chapter, he experiences unilevel disintegration, kick-started by a family crisis that alters his living environment. In the third, he experiences some spontaneous multi-level disintegration, which he tries to keep at bay through discipline. He nearly achieves a kind of false integration. In the fourth chapter, these efforts fall away to further spontaneous disintegration, followed by a more sustained multi-level disintegration, especially in the fifth chapter, and a conclusion that hints at a future of secondary integration. Throughout these chapters, Stephen shows signs of overexcitability, especially at his most important moments of growth, which Dabrowski notes is a common time for such states to appear. In the first chapter of Portrait, the very young Stephen Dedalus starts out in a state of what Dabrowski would call primitive integration, but with significant signs of developmental potential. His constant efforts to think through his environment and understand the adults and older children around him shows intellectual and sometimes imaginational overexcitability. As Dabrowski observed to be the case for individuals with primary integration, however, he is not selective about these environmental influences. Moreover, the chapter is structured as multiple vignettes of immediate impressions. The young Dedalus does not plan or show much awareness of the meaning of time. Also aspects of primitive integration, according to Dabrowski. Stephen's awareness of there being higher and lower ways to behave, however, grows throughout the chapter, and he even shows some signs of limited disintegration. At the very start of Portrait, Stephen appears fully integrated into his environment. He is so well integrated that he was baby Tuku of the story told by his father, and that observation is the only indication of self-awareness on his part. Otherwise, he observes the stimuli around himself, such as his father's hairy face, the maroon brush for Michael Davitt and the green brush for Parnell, 2 Irish nationalist leaders, carry no political meaning or association with ideals for him. They are mere sensation. Even when he is threatened with eagles pulling out his eyes, if he does not apologize for an unnamed transgression, he quickly returns to his state of integration, turning pull out his eyes, apologize, into a childish chant. This follows Dabrowski's observation that those in a primitive state of integration may, under duress, show signs of disintegration, but only briefly. In the next section, Stephen Dedalus, as the youngest boy in school, continues mostly in this state of primary integration, but shows signs of developmental potential. Schoolboy Stephen shows some basic awareness of higher and lower behaviors, but his knowledge primarily reflects the expectations and opinions of those around him. He does not tell on the boy who knocks him into a ditch of muddy water before he becomes ill, because his father had told him whatever he did, never to peach on a fellow. When asked by Nasty Roche about his father, his answer that Simon Dedalus is a gentleman shows also an awareness of higher and lower states of being, albeit ones fully aligned with the standards of his society. His assessment of Father Arnal as knowing more than Dante, a childish pronunciation of auntie, because he was a priest, shows this same alignment. It is unclear whether his assessment of Kickham and Roche, Rhodey Kickham was a decent fellow, but Nasty Roche was a stink, reflects his own experience of the two. Certainly Roche treats young Dedalus unkindly, or the general opinion in the schoolyard. This ambiguity is appropriate given Stephen's state of primary integration. His judgment has not diverged from the judgment of his social environment. The same idea applies to his efforts to win classroom competitions. In that case, his focus on the colors of the badges reflects his continued integration into the environment. He focuses on the concrete rather than abstract notions of who he ought to be. Indeed, sensations are emphasized throughout the second section as he ponders hot and cold and the sound rather than the meaning of the word suck. His continued integration is perhaps best reflected in how he has situated himself in his writing in his geography text. Stephen Dedalus, Class of Elements, Clongowes Wood, Salinas, County Kildare, Ireland, Europe, the world, the universe. Yet even his interaction with this text hints at his developmental potential, as he reads that alignment both forwards and backwards before concluding that it is not poetry. He feels that there is something better than the integration his own writing reflects, even if he cannot quite name it yet. Similarly, when he ponders whether it is right to be for Michael Davitt or Charles Parnell, he thinks not of what they stand for, but for the physicality of the differently colored brushes that stand for them. Yet, it pained him that he did not know well what politics meant. Both his thinking about his place in the universe and about politics take place the evening before he has to be sent to the clinic. His beginning to fall ill drives these steps toward abstraction and exaggerates both the intellectual overexcitability shown by these efforts to understand and the imaginational overexcitability that will follow as he pictures his own death and burial. His vision shows the creativity that, according to Dabrowski, expresses non-adaptation with the internal milieu and a transgression of the usual standards of adaptation to the external environment, which makes it part of a new phase of development. The section that follows Stephen's illness, in which the adults argue over Parnell and religion, shows Stephen's continued development. He tries to determine the right way to be, and initially tells himself that Dante must be right because she agrees with the priests. But here, he parts from the socially acceptable way of thinking, as considering what his father said about Dante having been a spoiled nun, he realizes that may have made her overly strict, not only politically, but also in her insistence that he should not spend time with Eileen, a Protestant child who was involved somehow in the earlier unnamed transgression. Who was right then? He asks himself, and instead of answering, he remembers the evening in the infirmary, in the dark waters, the light at the pierced, and the moan and sorrow from the people when they had heard, conflating his experience of illness with the death of Parnell. Stephen's uncertainty allows a space for early stirrings of disintegration, and where earlier this fear was dispersed into a childish chant, here the scene ends with him still afraid, raising his terror-stricken face, only to see his own father weeping. Following this experience, Stephen takes an action that shows him organizing both himself and those around him into higher and lower ways of being. After he is beaten by Father Arnal for not writing in class, despite his having broken his glasses by accident, he goes to see the rector to protest this maltreatment. He does so after his classmates encourage him, but he makes his decision to do so, at least in part, because a thing like that had been done by somebody in history, by some great person whose head was in the books of history. He has taken from his school's set texts ideals of behavior and applied them to his life. Though it does not exactly set him at odds with his environment to do so, his peers cheer for him afterwards, it does set him apart from the other pupils. The limited disintegration and signs of developmental potential in the first chapter set the stage for further development of the older Stephen of the second chapter. At the start of that chapter, he shows imaginational overexcitability by building up scenes inspired by the Count of Monte Cristo out of paper scraps. These scenes and the attitudes of the book will play a role in his later development, but perhaps more importantly, his family's declining fortunes lead to upheaval. He does not return to his school because his family can no longer afford Clongowes Wood. They move from suburban Blackrock to Dublin, which Stephen finds to be a new and complex sensation. And soon he shows signs of a unilevel disintegration. Dabrowski in Positive Disintegration notes that this sort of disintegration tends to arise in response to external stress or developmental crises. Stephen, in this chapter, withdraws from a party, noting that the mirth which in the beginning of the evening had seemed to him false and trivial was like a soothing air to him, passing gaily by his senses, hiding from other eyes the feverish agitation of his blood. He associates this agitation with his feelings for a girl, and that in turn later drives him not to act upon his attraction, but to write a long and frankly derivative poem about it. Afterwards, he stares in his mother's mirror, acting out the form of self-consciousness, but without much substance of it. There is a hint of the third factor in the observation that the ambition which he felt to stir at times in the darkness of his soul sought no outlet, but this is very limited, as Stephen cannot name that ambition, further showing his limited self-consciousness. The lack of self-consciousness and control, along with a lack of clear transformational dynamics, align with Dabrowski's description of unilevel disintegration. This disintegration continues as he returns to a Jesuit educational institution, this time Belvedere rather than Clongowes Wood. Within this unilevel disintegration, there are even early approaches to and instances of spontaneous multi-level disintegration. Stephen's father, Simon, in announcing that Stephen will return to school, also reveals that the rector to whom Stephen had protested his mistreatment found it all to be a joke. We do not see Stephen's immediate reaction, but this incident does plant a seed for future doubts and dissatisfactions. When we next see Stephen on the evening of the school's Whitsuntide play a few years later, he seems to be a model student, but he reflects on his experience in his first term there when his sensitive nature was still smarting under the lashes of an undivided and squalid way of life. His soul was still disquieted and cast down by the dull phenomenon of Dublin. This seems further sign of unilevel disintegration until he notes that all the leisure which his school life left him was passed in the company of subversive writers whose jibes and violence of speech set up a ferment in his brain before they passed out of it into his crude writings. Stephen is making choices that set him at odds with his milieu and that lead to him being tormented by his classmates for saying that Byron, whom they consider a heretic and immoral too, is a greater poet than Tennyson. He is making decisions. He is engaging in self-direction. After this remembered incident, Stephen stumbles away crying. In the narrative present, he feels removed from his peers and essentially without emotional response until after his performance on stage, when he suddenly feels nervous and flees until the odor of horse piss and rotted straw provides him some relief. In the argument over who is the greater writer, there's a sense of the multi-level. And this, and in his reading of other subversive writers, Stephen makes a conscious choice, but his reactions and emotions do not sustain multi-leveled disintegration yet. This position becomes more apparent on his trip to Cork with his father, when he thinks of his own equivocal position in Belvedere, a free boy, a leader of his own authority, proud and sensitive and suspicious, battling against the squalor of his life and against the riot of his mind. The sense of higher and lower selves is clear. When he wins a prize, he temporarily gains the upper hand in this battle, as he is able to take the family out to plays, make lonesome plans, and buy expensive items, including books. When the money runs out, there's a larger gap between who he is and who he wants to be, and his disintegration accelerates. Unable to reach the ideals that seemed possible, momentarily, he takes refuge in nightly wanderings, including visits to prostitutes. He is disintegrating without direction. Chapter 2 closes with Stephen in a dark night of his soul. In chapter 3, Stephen has continued to be treated as a model student, even becoming prefect of the sodality of the Blessed Virgin Mary, despite continuing behaviors that would surely be seen as sinful if known. He lives in self-contradiction, albeit fairly stably. Then comes the college's retreat. The sermons act upon his imaginational overexcitability, and he envisions words about the death of sinners, immediate judgment of the soul, and the final judgment of doomsday as applying directly to himself. Every word of it was for him. Against his sin, foul and secret, the whole wrath of God was aimed. The feeling that he has not lived up to his own standards leads to further disintegration, arguably spontaneous multi-level disintegration. Instead of sustaining and examining his conscience and values carefully, he seeks instead to regain a kind of primary integration. He prays, he confesses, he tells himself his soul was made fair and holy once more, holy and happy. The repetition of holy hints that he is still trying to convince himself. In chapter 4, it becomes clear that this false integration cannot last. At the start, he is going to extreme lengths to preserve that feeling of integration. He has a daily schedule of strict devotions, starting with early mass. He designates a different holy mystery for each day of the week. He prays for souls in purgatory and carries a rosary so he might be constantly praying. But he remains emotionally alienated. He had heard the names of the passions of love and hate pronounced solemnly on stage and in the pulpit, had found them set forth solemnly in books, and had wondered why his soul was unable to harbor them for any time, or to force his lips to utter their names with conviction. He mortifies his senses, each in turn, through unpleasant stimuli such as the sound of knives being sharpened or the smell of feces, and tells himself it is to avoid spiritual pride and to undo the sinful past. However, after his confession, he is supposed to believe that he has been purified of those sins already. The contradiction and the deliberate exposure of self to unpleasantness suggests that his reintegration is neither full nor satisfactory. This is especially true given that seeking out unpleasant odors featured in his earlier disintegration. Indeed, he comes to conclude that a restless feeling of guilt would always be present with him. He would confess and repent and be absolved, confess and repent again, and be absolved again fruitlessly. Thus, the stage is set for his multi-level disintegration. It is not a disintegration in service of achieving a higher Christian spirituality, though with this particular setup, it could be. Despite the alienation, one could read his efforts as an admirable self-discipline in that direction. Certainly, that is how his college's director reads it. He goes so far as to call Stephen into his office to ask whether he might have a calling to become a priest. Stephen has imagined himself as a priest at the Mass, his imaginational overexcitability in evidence again, but finds himself unable to say yes without knowing why, and despite having even opened his mouth to say yes. After this conversation, Stephen begins to imagine not merely being a priest, but the harsher reality of living in the novitiate. And at these perhaps more realistic imaginings, from every part of his being, unrest began to irradiate. he is beginning to feel not only that he cannot return to primary integration, but also that the higher state to which he thought he was working is not his true higher self. He anticipates his coming multi-level disintegration in the language of sin, because that is the language he accesses most easily. He would fall. He had not yet fallen, but he would fall in an instant. But this time, his falling is self-directed, away from the church. He was destined to learn his own wisdom apart from others, or to learn the wisdom of others himself, wandering among the snares of the world. In the next scene, Stephen is preparing for university and feels that in doing so, he had passed beyond the challenge of the centuries who had stood as guardians of his boyhood and had sought to keep him among them that he might be subject to them and serve their ends. The director, encouraging him to join the priesthood, is now seen as an obstacle toward becoming his higher self. This leads to a spontaneous disintegration that sets up the more sustained and multi-level disintegration of the fifth and final chapter. In that final chapter, Stephen is a university student and fully engaged in multi-level disintegration. He neglects his bodily needs, his hygiene, leaving his mother to observe that it's a poor case when a university student is so dirty that his mother has to wash him. He wanders the streets in sensory motor overexcitability, pondering philosophy and literature, but he loses track of days and times so that he misses or arrives late at lectures. His thoughts during these perambulations resemble the first example Dabrowski gives in Positive Disintegration of multi-level disintegration, in which a teacher says he has observed in himself obsessions with thinking, experiencing, and acting. When Stephen pictures the English lecture, he imagines his peers carefully taking notes on received interpretations and ideas about authors, while his own head was unbent, for his thoughts wandered abroad. His disintegration is both lower and higher. During his conversation with the dean, he recognizes that he has not yet become the artist or thinker he wants to be. Answering the dean's question as to when they might see something from him regarding aesthetics, that he can only work according to Aristotle and Aquinas, as he has not yet done something for myself by their light. It is in the context of this conversation and of Stephen's disintegration that the much remarked incident of the tundish occurs. The dean, an English convert to Catholicism, mentions a funnel. Stephen is unfamiliar with the word, noting that the object is commonly called a tundish in Lower Drumcondra, where they speak the best English. The dean remarks repeatedly on how fascinating the word tundish is, leading Stephen to reflect. The language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. How different are the words, home, Christ, ale, master, on his lips and on mine. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. This passage is commonly viewed through an Irish nationalist lens, as reflecting English being a colonial language imposed on Ireland. But given Stephen's later refusal to accept that Irish is his language, having even dropped an Irish language class after just one lesson, this interpretation seems at best incomplete. Irish identity and the lack of ownership over English accorded to those in position of lesser status are part of Stephen's alienation. But there is also a personal alienation here. He is still figuring out his relationship to language, and this process is taking place in an environment that he increasingly believes to be at odds with his becoming his better self. Earlier, he thought university to be his escape from such an environment, but now he sees that it is not enough. When the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets. As a result of this perception, the seeming pathway to resolution of Stephen's multi-level disintegration is for him to leave Ireland. In his penultimate journal entry, he states that he goes, to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. He believes this journey will lead to secondary integration, and the novel ends with this as a possibility. Indeed, the strength of Portrait being set up as a Künstlerroman creates a structural impetus to read the ending as leading towards secondary integration. Stephen's return in Ulysses will show us, however, that he's not quite there yet. In both Dabrowski's theories and Joyce's Portrait, we see the importance of internal factors for development. If Stephen is able to achieve the greatness to which he aspires, it is not because he was born to high status. He is neither noble nor royal, though his family is comfortable at the start. Rather, it is his internal drive and developmental potential that move him forward. He directs his journey. This is characteristic of modernist narratives and is what Foucault identifies as internalized discipline. Dabrowski's theories are modernist theories, even as Joyce's narrative in Portrait is a moderate one. Thank you for listening. This presentation is only the start of a broader project on Joyce and Dabrowski. The Künstlerroman form makes Portrait an obvious place to start, but the paralysis of the characters in Dubliners also shows what happens to those who do not progress. Ulysses not only continues Stephen's story, but also presents him with a father figure who has achieved a kind of secondary integration. And Finnegan's Wake, as an encyclopedic work, surely has something to say on the matter. I look forward to sharing more findings as my project progresses.